I hired a guy to mow the lawn, but he called and whispered, "Ma'am, there's someone in your basement. I can hear crying." I froze. My husband said the basement had been sealed for 20 years. I grabbed the key and slowly walked down. Good day, dear listeners. It's Clara again. I'm glad you're here with me. Please like this video and listen to my story till the end, and let me know which city you're listening from. That way I can see how far my story has traveled. I used to believe that the house on Clover Mill Road was the safest place in the world. Raymond and I had bought it in 1987, when Dennis was just a boy with grass-stained knees and a gap-toothed smile. We'd painted the porch ourselves, planted the rose bushes along the south fence, hung a wind chime by the kitchen window that sang every time a storm came through. After Raymond passed, 4 years ago now, quietly, in his sleep, the way a good man deserves to go, the house became my anchor. I was 71 years old, reasonably healthy, and perfectly capable of managing my own life. Thank you very much. I had my garden. I had my neighbor Patricia 2 doors down. I had my Tuesday Bible study group and my Friday trips to the farmer's market. I was not lonely. I was not lost. I was simply a woman living in the home she'd built with her own hands and her own love. Dennis worried about me, or so he said. He started coming around more often after Raymond died. At first I thought it was grief, his way of staying close to his father's memory. He'd sit at my kitchen table and drink my coffee and talk about the property taxes, about the roof that would need replacing in a few years, about whether I'd considered downsizing to something more manageable. I'd smile and pour him more coffee and change the subject. The house was paid off. The house was mine. There was nothing to manage except my own contentment. Then he married Cheryl. I want to be careful here, because I'm not the kind of woman who dislikes a daughter-in-law on principle. I gave Cheryl every chance. I invited her to Thanksgiving, to Easter, to Raymond's memorial service in the spring. She came with her highlighted hair and her firm handshakes and her way of looking at my furniture like she was already pricing it. She called me Marjorie when everyone who knew me called me Marge. It was a small thing. Small things have a way of adding up. It was Cheryl's idea, I found out later, to seal the basement. Raymond had used it as a workshop. It still smelled of sawdust and machine oil. After he died, I'd go down there sometimes just to sit and feel him near. Then one spring, Dennis came by with 2 workers I'd never met and told me there was a moisture problem, a mold risk, that the stairs were a liability. He had it sealed within a week. New drywall over the door, a coat of paint the color of old cream. He showed me the contractor's invoice, $3,000, which he said he'd paid himself as a gift. What kind of mother argues with a gift? I told myself it was love. I told myself a lot of things. The first strange sign came 6 months after the sealing. I was in the kitchen at 2 in the morning. I've always been a poor sleeper, making chamomile tea, and I heard something beneath the floor, a sound so faint I might have dreamed it, a rhythmic tapping. I stood very still with my mug in both hands, listening. It stopped. I told myself it was pipes. Old houses breathe in the night. I went back to bed. The second sign was Dennis himself. He began stopping by unannounced, not weekly, but sometimes twice in a week, always with some excuse. A casserole from Cheryl, a light bulb he'd noticed was out last time. He never stayed long, but he always walked through the house in that particular way of his, glancing toward the sealed wall in the hallway, then relaxing slightly when everything looked undisturbed. I noticed, but I told myself I was imagining things. At 71, you start to doubt your own perceptions. People encourage you to, The third sign was the smell. It was faint, and it came and went, and I couldn't place it for weeks. Something organic. Something that didn't belong in a house where only one old woman lived and kept things very clean. I scrubbed the kitchen. I checked the refrigerator. I had the garbage disposal serviced. The smell remained, rising sometimes from the floorboards near the hallway, gone before I could track it. I hired Tyler Beaumont to cut the grass on a Wednesday in late September. He was 19, Patricia's nephew's boy, quiet and polite and thorough. I was at my book club across town when my phone rang. I saw his name on the screen and answered, expecting something ordinary. A question about the edging, maybe, or the back gate latch. But his voice was barely above a whisper. "Ma'am, there's someone in your basement. I can hear crying." I stood in Patricia's sister's living room with my phone pressed to my ear and did not breathe. "Tyler," I said, "are you certain?" "Yes, ma'am," he whispered. "It's coming through the window well on the north side. Somebody's down there. Somebody's crying." My husband had told me that basement was sealed for 20 years. I drove home in 11 minutes. I sat in the driveway for a long moment, looking at my house, my safe, familiar, beloved house, and felt it become something I didn't recognize. Then I took the key from the glove box. I walked to the front door, and I went inside. The sealed wall in the hallway had always bothered me more than I let on. Not for any reason I could name precisely, just the blunt wrongness of it, a door-shaped absence in a house that had always been open to itself. Dennis had done a tidy job. The drywall was smooth, the paint matched. But if you ran your fingers along the baseboard, you could feel where the old doorframe sat beneath, patient as a held breath. Tyler was waiting on the porch. He was pale and keeping his voice low, though we were alone. He showed me the window well on the north side of the house. A half moon of concrete sunk below grade, the kind Raymond had installed for ventilation decades ago. The glass was fogged from inside. And when we stood very still in the cool September air, I heard it. Not loud, almost nothing, in fact. A sound like a woman trying not to make any sound at all. I told Tyler to wait in his truck and to call 911 if I didn't come back out in 10 minutes. He started to argue. I looked at him the way I used to look at Dennis when he was 12 and testing me, and Tyler walked to his truck. I went to the garage for Raymond's pry bar. I am not a large woman. I am 5'3", 140 pounds, with arthritis in my left hand that makes cold mornings difficult. But I have also re-roofed a garden shed, replaced a hot water heater, and once changed a tire on the interstate at 64 years old in the rain. I know how to use tools. I know how to use them with intention. The drywall came away from the frame in 3 sections. Behind it was the original door. Hollow core wood, painted over, the hinges intact. The knob had been removed and the hole plugged with a rubber stopper. I pulled the stopper out. I pushed the door open. The smell hit me first. Beneath it, beneath the sourness and the closed-in air, was something human. Soap. Sweat. The faint sweetness of someone who had been eating very little. The stairs were dark. I found the string for the old pull bulb light at the bottom. Raymond had never updated the fixture. And the basement filled with pale yellow light. She was in the corner behind Raymond's old workbench. A young woman, perhaps 25. Small, dark-skinned, with close-cropped hair and eyes that had gone very wide and very still at the light. She was sitting on a folded blanket with a plastic bucket nearby and a case of water bottles stacked against the wall and a paper bag that had once held food. She was wearing a gray sweatshirt that was too large for her and clean socks, which struck me later as one of the saddest details. That someone had thought to give her clean socks. We looked at each other. She spoke first. Her voice was barely a sound. Are you his mother? I said. Yes, I am. And then I sat down on Raymond's old shop stool because my legs had stopped cooperating, and I said, Can you tell me your name? Amma, she said. Amma Asante. I will not describe everything Amma told me that afternoon because some of it is hers to tell or not tell, and some of it later became part of a legal record, and some of it I am not yet able to put into plain language without my hands shaking. What I will tell you is the shape of it. She had come from Ghana 2 years earlier on a student visa. She had met Cheryl through a church outreach program. Cheryl had offered her a room, cheap rent, a safe neighborhood, while Amma sorted out a work authorization complication. Within 2 months, Cheryl and Dennis had taken Amma's documents. They told her she'd be deported if she went to anyone. They told her she owed them money for the room, for the food, for their silence. They moved her to the basement. They listed her on a fraudulent lease agreement to collect housing assistance in her name. They had been doing this, the fraud, the confinement, for 14 months. 14 months? I sat in my husband's basement in my husband's house, and I looked at this young woman and I thought, how much of my life has been built on things I chose not to look at closely? That thought was dangerous. I let myself have it for exactly 90 seconds. Then I put it away. There are 2 ways to respond to a catastrophe. You can collapse into the grief of it, or you can make a list. I have always been a list person. Raymond used to tease me about it. You'd make a list at the end of the world, Marge. Maybe so, Raymond. Maybe so. Here is what I knew. Amma needed medical attention. Amma needed her documents recovered. Dennis and Cheryl needed to be held accountable. Legally, formally, without any possibility of a quiet family resolution that let them walk away. And I needed to move carefully, because Dennis would know something had changed the moment I acted, and Dennis was 45 years old and not kind, and had access to lawyers. Here is what I decided. I would not call 911 from the house. I didn't know if Dennis had any way of monitoring the property. A camera I hadn't noticed, a neighbor he'd cultivated. I would get Amma out first. I would take her somewhere safe. And then I would make the calls that could not be undone. I helped Amma up the stairs. Tyler, God bless him, was still in his truck. He drove us to Patricia's house without asking a single question, which told me he already understood that questions could wait. What does a mother do when she discovers her son is a monster? She makes a list. She keeps moving. She does not look away a second time. Patricia Odom has been my neighbor for 22 years, and she is the kind of woman who, when you arrive at her door with a half-starved stranger and a look on your face that says, "Don't ask yet," puts the kettle on and pulls out the good blanket from the hall closet. That is what she did. She put Amma on the couch with the blanket and a bowl of chicken soup from the pot she kept simmering on Wednesdays, and she sat across from me at her kitchen table while I used her landline. Deliberately, consciously, not my cell phone, to call the police. I asked for a detective. I said I had a situation involving false imprisonment and document theft and suspected fraud, and that I needed someone senior, and that I was not going to repeat myself to 4 different people before someone took me seriously. There was a pause. Then they transferred me to a Detective Reyes, who had a level, careful voice and who listened without interrupting for 6 minutes while I explained in precise order what I had found and what I had been told. "Mrs. Hawkins," he said when I finished, "I need you and Ms. Asante to come in, tonight, if possible." "We'll be there in an hour," I said. The police station was a 40-minute drive. Patricia drove. I didn't trust my hands on the wheel just yet. Amma sat in the back seat, freshly washed and wearing a sweater of Patricia's that was slightly too wide in the shoulders, and she looked out the window at the passing streetlights with an expression I recognized from my own mirror in the days after Raymond died. The face of someone recalibrating what the world is. Detective Reyes was a compact man in his 40s, with a legal pad and reading glasses he kept taking on and off. He interviewed Amma first, with a female officer present and a victim's advocate from the county who arrived within 30 minutes. Faster than I expected. I waited in the hallway on a plastic chair, and I was grateful for the plastic chair's cold practicality. Gratitude for small, solid things was carrying me a long way that night. Then he interviewed me. I told him everything. The ceiling of the basement, which I now understood, had happened not because of moisture, but because Amma had been moved there, and Dennis needed to control access. The smell. The tapping I'd heard at 2 a.m. and dismissed as pipes. The unannounced visits. The way Dennis always checked the wall and then relaxed. I told him about the fraudulent lease. Amma had described how Cheryl had drawn it up, how Dennis had filed it, how they deposited the monthly assistance payments into a joint account Amma had never been permitted to access. "Do you have any documentation of your own, Mrs. Hawkins?" Detective Reyes asked. "Not yet," I said, "but I know where to look." This was true, because I am organized in the way that only people who've managed a household alone for decades can be organized. Raymond had kept a fireproof lockbox in the bedroom closet. I had kept it after his death, and I had added to it property documents, insurance policies, the deed. But I also remembered, now, with the cold clarity of a woman who has just rearranged everything she thought she knew, that the previous January, Dennis had asked if he could store some paperwork at my house while he and Cheryl were between filing systems. I had let him put a folder in the file cabinet in the spare room without looking at it. At the time, it had seemed like nothing. I asked Detective Reyes if he could have someone accompany me back to the house. An officer named Carver drove me home at 11:30 that night. I went directly to the spare room. I opened the file cabinet. The folder Dennis had left was still there, manila, unlabeled. Inside it, a lease agreement, dated 14 months prior, bearing Amma Asante's signature. Or something meant to look like it. A printed bank routing form. A letter on County Housing Authority letterhead confirming monthly payments. And a handwritten note in Cheryl's rounded, careful cursive that said only, D. Keep this off-site. Don't want it anywhere near the house in case. Officer Carver photographed every page. He bagged the folder as evidence. He was quiet and professional and did not editorialize, but when he turned to leave, he said, "You did the right thing, ma'am," in a voice that meant it. I stood in my spare room and held the edge of the file cabinet, because the room was tilting very slightly. When does a mother stop being a mother and start being a witness? I didn't have an answer. What I had was a case number. I had Reyes's card. I had the certain knowledge that by morning Dennis would know something had moved. Tyler had parked his truck in front of my house for 20 minutes, the basement wall was open, and Dennis had at least one neighbor he was friendly with on the next block. He would come. He would try to manage me the way he had always managed me, with a patient voice and a reasonable explanation and the subtle implication that I was old and emotional, and perhaps not thinking clearly. I went to bed at 1 a.m. I did not sleep particularly well, but I slept, because what Dennis didn't know yet was that this time I had already stopped being manageable. By Thursday morning, the plan had 3 parts. I had written them on a yellow legal pad the night before, when sleep kept sliding away from me. First, ensure Amma had legal representation and medical care, independent of anything I could provide. Second, cooperate fully with Detective Reyes's investigation and provide any additional documentation he requested. Third, consult my own attorney, Howard Pell, who had handled Raymond's estate and was a careful, unshowy man I trusted, before Dennis had the chance to complicate matters legally. I called Howard at 8:15 in the morning. He picked up on the third ring. "Marjorie," he said, "this is not a simple situation." "No," I agreed. "But I'm not asking for simple, I'm asking for thorough." He told me to come in at noon and to bring whatever documentation I had retained. He also told me, gently but clearly, to stop answering Dennis's calls until we had spoken, which meant that when Dennis called at 8:47, then again at 9:12, then again at 9:58, I watched the phone light up from across the kitchen and let it ring. Patricia had taken Amma to the county medical center that morning. The victim's advocate, a woman named Darlene, who wore orthopedic shoes and spoke with precise, steady kindness, had connected Amma with an immigration attorney named Gerald Park, who had handled asylum and trafficking cases for 15 years. Gerald moved fast. By 10 o'clock, a formal request had been filed to halt any deportation proceedings and to flag Amma's visa situation for review under trafficking protections. Her documents, Detective Reyes informed me by phone, would be a matter for the investigation. But the legal protections were in place. Amma was safe, not healed. That would take time none of us could schedule. But safe. I was in Howard's office on Elm Street reviewing the documentation when my cell phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. I answered. "Mom?" Dennis's voice was compressed into something I hadn't heard from him since he was a teenager caught in a lie. "I need to talk to you. Now." "I'm with my attorney," I said. Silence. Then, "Your attorney?" "Yes, Dennis." Another silence. Different in quality. Thicker. Colder. "You don't know what you're doing," he said. "I know exactly what I'm doing," I said, and ended the call. They were at my house when I returned that afternoon. Both of them. Dennis's car was in my driveway at an angle that was slightly too aggressive, the way people park when they want to signal occupation. Cheryl was on my porch, and she had done something to her face that was meant to look like concern. "Marjorie," she said when I got out of the car, "we need to talk. This has all been a terrible misunderstanding." I walked past her and unlocked my door. I let them in because I wanted to look at them and because Howard had told me that a recorded conversation, my phone in my pocket, running, might be valuable, and because I am 71 years old and I have looked difficulty in the face before. Cheryl sat at my kitchen table, the same table where I had served them coffee for years. And she told me that Amma had been a troubled young woman, that she and Dennis had tried to help her, that the housing arrangement had been informal and misrepresented by Amma herself, that they were victims, too, of a manipulative person who was now using an old woman's good intentions against her own son. She spoke for approximately 4 minutes. It was a well-organized speech. I suspected she had rehearsed it. "And the note," I said, when she finished. "In Cheryl's handwriting, in my file cabinet, the one that says, 'Keep this off-site.' What does that misunderstanding look like?" Dennis's expression changed. In that moment, he looked less like my son and more like a person calculating odds. I watched it happen. I had never seen it so plainly before. Perhaps because I had never made him feel genuinely cornered before. "You need to withdraw your statement," he said. "If you don't, this will go places none of us want it to go. I have documentation that you've shown signs of cognitive decline. Howard Pell will not look credible beside a geriatric specialist I can bring in who has concerns about your—" "Stop," I said. He stopped. "I am recording this conversation. What you just described is witness intimidation. You might want to call your own attorney before you say anything else." Cheryl stood up very quickly. Dennis went pale. Not red, as I might have expected, but pale, the blood leaving his face with remarkable efficiency. He opened his mouth. He closed it. He looked at Cheryl. Cheryl looked at her handbag. They left. My hands were trembling after, but only slightly, and only for a few minutes. I made tea. I sat in Raymond's chair by the front window and watched Dennis's car back unevenly out of the driveway. I thought, this is not over. But I have not lost. Those are different things, and it matters to know the difference. I gave myself 4 days. Patricia came by each evening. We watched old films, and she didn't ask me to be braver than I was already being. On the 3rd day, I slept 8 hours for the first time in a week. On the 4th day, I was ready again. The envelope arrived on a Tuesday by certified mail. Inside was a letter on the stationery of a downtown firm I'd never heard of, Kellner, Roth & Associates, and a cashier's check for $40,000. The letter was written in the measured language of people who are paid by the word to sound reasonable. It described a proposed private settlement of all outstanding concerns. It noted that my son and his wife wished to preserve family unity and avoid the trauma of public legal proceedings. It listed, in a footnote styled as an afterthought, 4 names: doctors, specialists, who had agreed to provide affidavits regarding age-related cognitive vulnerability in elderly witnesses. I read it twice. I set it on the kitchen table beside my coffee cup. I looked at the check. $40,000 is a great deal of money, and not enough money. And Dennis knew both things when he sent it. I photographed the letter and the check and sent both images to Detective Reyes and to Howard Pell within 10 minutes of opening the envelope. Howard called back in 20. Attempted bribery of a witness, he said, with a satisfaction he was professionally obligated to understate. Don't cash it, don't return it, don't touch it again. Leave it exactly where it is. The check sat on my kitchen table for 11 days while it became part of the evidence file. Every morning, I made my coffee and looked at it and felt nothing in particular, which surprised me at first. I had expected anger or grief or some complex mixture of both. What I felt instead was a kind of clarifying cold, the sort of cold that burns away the inessential. Was Dennis always this person? I asked myself that question a great deal during those days. I didn't arrive at a satisfying answer. Perhaps some people are always what they become, and the circumstances simply remove the camouflage. Perhaps I had seen the early signs, the small cruelties, the entitled reasoning, the way he'd looked at my house even when Raymond was alive, and chosen to call them something gentler. Mothers do that. It is both our strength and our precise undoing. But I was not undone. Gerald Park called on Wednesday to update me on Amma's situation. Her visa status had been formally reclassified under federal trafficking protections, which meant she had a legal right to remain in the country while the investigation was active and potentially well beyond it. She was staying with a host family connected through an immigration services network, a couple in their 50s named the Oyelarans, who had done this before and knew how to make space without making demands. Gerald said she was eating well. He said she had asked about me. I drove to see her on Thursday. She was sitting in the Oyelaran's sunlit kitchen, and she looked different than she had in my basement. Not unrecognizable, but expanded somehow, as if being in natural light had returned her to a fuller version of herself. She stood up when I came in. We did not hug immediately because we didn't quite know each other yet in the way that permits that, but she took my hand in both of hers and held it. "Thank you," she said. "Don't thank me yet," I told her. "Thank me when it's finished." We sat together for 2 hours. She told me more about her life, her family in Accra, her plan to study environmental engineering, the church outreach meeting where Cheryl had approached her with a warm smile and a laminated card describing available housing. I told her about Raymond, about the basement as it had been, full of sawdust and projects half finished. We made the space something other than what it had been. Darlene, the victim's advocate, invited me to attend a community support group meeting that Friday. Not for victims, she clarified, but for family members who had found themselves at the intersection of someone they loved and something terrible. I went, mostly out of stubbornness. There were 7 people in a church basement, and a woman named Connie who ran the group with calm practicality and coffee in a styrofoam cup that was better than it had any right to be. I came back the following Friday and the Friday after that. Patricia organized, without asking me, a quiet network of people who began checking on me. Not intrusively, not with the suffocating softness people sometimes bring to the elderly, but practically. A casserole left on the porch. A text that said only, "Thinking of you. Respond if you want. Don't if you don't." Tom Beaumont, Tyler's uncle, offered to park his truck in my driveway twice a week so the house looked less unoccupied. I accepted. What does it mean to be supported? I had thought for years that it meant being protected from difficulty. I learned that autumn that it means something simpler and more sustaining. It means being seen clearly by people who do not require you to be less than you are while you do the hard thing anyway. Dennis and Cheryl were watching. I knew it. They were waiting for a crack. A moment of wavering, a late-night call when I might be tired enough to negotiate. The phone was quiet. The check sat on my table. I waited too, but I did not waver. They came on a Sunday afternoon, which was deliberate. Sunday afternoons have a particular texture. Slower, softer. The week's armoring not yet back in place. Dennis had always been observant in small, tactical ways. He knocked rather than used the bell, which was also deliberate. A bell sounds like a demand. A knock can be made to sound tentative, even humble. I looked at them through the side window before I opened the door. Dennis was wearing a jacket I hadn't seen before. Soft gray, the kind of jacket worn to signal calm, harmlessness, someone who has reconsidered. Cheryl had brought flowers. Pale yellow dahlias wrapped in craft paper, tied with twine. She had taken care with them. That, too, was deliberate. I let them in. I did not take the flowers. "We've been doing a lot of thinking, Mom," Dennis said, sitting at the kitchen table. He always sat at the kitchen table, as if the familiarity of the location meant something, as if it could metabolize what was happening into something ordinary. "We made mistakes. We want to make this right." "Tell me what right looks like to you," I said. Cheryl set the flowers on the counter and folded her hands with a practiced composure that I recognize now for exactly what it was. A performance, and not a particularly original one. "Amma is being taken care of. She's safe. She's with people. The worst is over for her. Dragging this through a courtroom, for months, maybe years, doesn't undo anything. It only creates more pain. For everyone." She paused, and in the pause she tilted her head slightly, the way people do when they want to appear to be feeling something. "For you, Marjorie. Think about what this does to you." "I am thinking about what it does to me," I said. "You'd be testifying against your own son," Dennis said. His voice had dropped into something almost gentle. I recognized the register. It was the voice he'd used as a teenager to negotiate curfews, to explain away bad grades, to make me feel that my instincts were the problem. "The press will be involved," Our family name. Dad's name. Everything you and Dad built here. Don't, I said. He paused. Don't use your father, I said. Raymond would not recognize you right now, and I think some part of you knows that. Something shifted in Dennis's face. Not remorse. I need to be accurate here, even if accuracy is unpleasant. What shifted was the mask. Not the person behind it becoming visible, exactly, but the mask slipping just enough to show that there was a mask. His expression hardened at the jaw. The gentleness receded like a tide that had only ever been decorative. You're a 71-year-old woman living alone, he said. The legal process is slow and expensive and exhausting. Howard Pell is good, but he's a state law. This will go beyond him. You'll be deposed, repeatedly. Your memory, your mental state, your fitness as a witness, all of that becomes fair game. Kellner and Roth have resources that... You're threatening me, I said. I'm being realistic, he said. You're threatening your mother, I said, at her own kitchen table on a Sunday afternoon with flowers your wife bought to soften the threat. I want you to sit with that for a moment. The silence that followed was not empty. It was full. Full of everything the three of us were not saying. Full of 30 years of Sunday dinners and holiday phone calls and small surrenders I had made in the name of keeping peace in a family that, it turned out, had not been keeping peace at all. It had simply been keeping quiet. Those are not the same thing. I had confused them for a long time. Cheryl stood up. This is a mistake, she said. But she was speaking to Dennis, not to me. The first honest thing she'd said since they arrived. He stood too. The kitchen felt smaller than it had been. I am not a physically imposing woman. I am aware of this. But I did not move from my chair. If you proceed, Cheryl said, and now the warmth was entirely gone from her voice, stripped away to something efficient and cold. We will make this as difficult as possible. For you and for that girl. Amma, I said. Her name is Amma. They left. The kitchen door closed behind them, and I heard Dennis's car start in the driveway and pull away too quickly. Gravel scattering across the concrete in a small, petulant spray. I sat at the table for a while. The dahlias were still on the counter. Outside, a car passed slowly on Clover Mill Road, a neighbor, probably, coming home from church, and the ordinary sound of it was steadying in a way I hadn't expected. Life outside this kitchen was continuing at its normal pace. That mattered. I want to be honest. I was afraid. Not of the legal process. I trusted Howard. I trusted Reyes. I trusted that facts, when properly marshaled, have a weight that emotional pressure cannot displace. What I was afraid of was something older and more irrational. The fear a mother carries like a stone in her chest, that loving someone does not protect you from what they become, that you can do everything right and still sit in your own kitchen being threatened by the child you taught to tie his shoes, who learned to read at your knee, who you held through fevers and disappointments and the particular grief of a boy losing his father. Is this the worst of it? I asked myself. Or is there more? There was more. There is always more. But here is what I also knew, sitting in the kitchen with the afternoon light going orange on the walls. Fear, when you don't let it stop you, doesn't weaken you. It clarifies. It strips away everything that was never essential and leaves you standing in the exact center of what matters. I picked up the dahlias and put them in a vase with water. They were pretty flowers, and they hadn't done anything wrong. Then I called Detective Reyes and told him about the visit. He listened without interrupting, and when I finished, he said, "Good. That's all on record now." 4 words. Exactly enough. The trial did not happen all at once the way it does in films. It happened over 4 months of pretrial motions and depositions, and mornings in Howard's office, reviewing documents I had already reviewed, and afternoons in Detective Reyes's conference room, reviewing others. It happened in small increments, in legal language that was not designed for clarity, in a process that was thorough in the way that only slow things can be thorough. I attended every session I was permitted to attend. I took notes in a spiral notebook with a blue cover. I wore the same cardigan most days because its weight across my shoulders felt like company. I don't regret the slowness. Slow meant solid. The hearing that broke everything open was on a Thursday in late January. The courtroom was county level, not dramatic in size or architecture, fluorescent lit and practical, with a judge named Rosario who had 22 years on the bench and a face that conveyed, without theater, that she had heard everything and was not interested in performance. Amma testified first. She had been preparing for weeks with the prosecution team and with Gerald and, I believe, in the quiet way that people prepare for things that require them to go back into rooms they would rather not enter. She sat in the witness chair in a dark blue blazer, and she spoke clearly, and she did not look at Dennis and Cheryl once. She did not need to. What she described needed no dramatic framing. Dates, locations, actions, the specific texture of 14 months. Facts, precisely organized. The courtroom was very still while she spoke. Even the stenographer seemed to be holding her breath. When she stepped down, she caught my eye from across the room. I nodded. She nodded. Dennis's attorney, a carefully groomed man from Kellner, Roth named Whitford, had built his defense on 2 pillars. First, that Amma's confinement had been a misunderstanding arising from a complicated and mutually agreed informal housing arrangement. And second, that the key witness for the prosecution, an elderly woman with no legal training and an admitted emotional investment in the outcome, had interpreted events through the distorting lens of grief and age. I had expected this. Howard and I had prepared for it. I was called in the afternoon. I took the stand in my good Navy dress, which I'd worn to Raymond's memorial service, and I told myself, "You are not a grieving woman. You are a witness. Those are different things, and today you are the second one." Whitford cross-examined me with a patience calibrated to seem like courtesy. He asked about my medical history, my sleep, whether I had ever experienced confusion or disorientation, whether I had discussed the case with other parties before filing my statement, whether my relationship with my son had been strained prior to these events. His questions were designed to make me seem like someone who had arrived at a conclusion and then assembled the facts to support it. A woman whose love had curdled into persecution, whose grief had calcified into something she'd mistaken for truth. I answered every question with the precision of someone who had spent 71 years learning which details matter and why. I did not become flustered. I did not become cold. I did not reach for emotion when fact was available. I was simply accurate, and accuracy, I have found, is the thing that makes a certain kind of person very uncomfortable. Whitford returned to the same questions twice from different angles, hoping to find inconsistency. He did not find any. Then the prosecution played the recording. Howard had submitted it the previous week. The kitchen conversation from the Sunday, when Dennis and Cheryl had come with the Dahlias. County law permitted single-party recording. My phone had been in my cardigan pocket, running through the entire visit. The audio was not perfect. There was the ambient sound of the refrigerator, occasional traffic from Clover Mill Road. But the voices were clear. Dennis was clear. You're a 71-year-old woman living alone. Your memory, your mental state, all of that becomes fair game. Cheryl was clear. We will make this as difficult as possible for you and for that girl. The courtroom had that particular quality of quiet that comes when a room of people is very still and very attentive. Not the quiet of indifference, the quiet of collective understanding, arriving all at once. Dennis was called to testify the following morning. He had prepared carefully. I could see the preparation in the controlled tempo of his answers, the thoughtful pauses, the self-correcting that was meant to look like honesty. But cross-examination is not a prepared speech, and the prosecutor, a young woman named Estela Vargas, who had spent 3 years in the county DA's trafficking unit, had a gift for the question that arrives from an unexpected angle, the question that assumes one fact in order to reveal the falseness of another. She asked Dennis to confirm a specific date. He confirmed it. She produced a cell tower record that placed him at a location inconsistent with the version of events he'd just confirmed. He hesitated. He revised. He said he might have been mistaken about the date. Whitford objected. The objection was overruled. She produced a bank statement. She produced the handwritten note in Cheryl's handwriting, photographed from my file cabinet. She asked Cheryl, who testified after Dennis, to confirm that she had written the note. Cheryl said she couldn't be certain it was hers. Estela produced 3 other handwriting samples from existing documents Cheryl had signed. She compared them on a display screen, side by side, for the courtroom to see. Cheryl said she couldn't be certain about those either. "Mrs. Hawkins Cole," Estela said, "are you telling this court that you cannot identify your own handwriting?" Cheryl's attorney intervened. But the moment was done. It exists in the record. It will always exist in the record. Some things, once they are in the light, cannot be put back. Dennis, in his final testimony, said something that I think he had been telling himself so long that he believed it, which is perhaps the most dangerous kind of lie, the kind you tell yourself until it becomes indistinguishable from memory. We were trying to help her. We made mistakes in how we did it, but our intentions— "Your intentions," Judge Rosario said from the bench, with a tone that required no further amplification and received none, "are not before this court. The actions are." Dennis stopped speaking. And in the silence, I saw it. Not guilt, not remorse. Those were still beyond him. But the specific, clarifying shock of a person who has run out of room to maneuver, who has told the last version of the story and found the room unmoved, who has come to the edge of the narrative they've been constructing for years and found nothing behind it but open air. What do you feel, I had asked myself many times in the past months, when you look at your son? On that Thursday afternoon, in that fluorescent-lit courtroom, looking at the man who had grown up at my table and learned to lie so fluently that he'd almost made me doubt my own eyes. I felt clear, not happy, not relieved, not angry, clear, the way a window feels after a long rain has washed it, and the light comes through properly for the first time in longer than you'd noticed. The verdict came on a Friday morning in March. I had not expected it to feel the way it felt. I had prepared myself, I thought, for every permutation, for a hung jury, for a partial conviction, for the particular exhaustion of a justice that arrives half-formed. I had told myself many times and with conviction that the process mattered as much as the outcome, that having stood up clearly and at cost was itself a kind of completion. But I am also a practical woman, and I will tell you plainly, when the forewoman read guilty, on all counts, 4 counts, including federal trafficking charges that the DA's office had added in December, I put my hand over my mouth and I cried in a way I had not cried since the morning Raymond died. Dennis received 7 years. The federal sentencing guidelines for trafficking-related charges are not lenient, and the additional counts of fraud, witness intimidation, yes, the recording, yes, the certified letter with the cashier's check, and unlawful confinement, had built a structure that Whitford and his firm, for all their resources, could not dismantle. Dennis stood at the defense table and received the sentence in a stillness that was either dignity or shock. From where I sat, I could not distinguish between them. Perhaps he couldn't either. Cheryl received 4 years. Her attorney had attempted a plea arrangement in the final weeks before trial, offering cooperation in exchange for reduced charges. The DA's office considered it and declined. The note in her handwriting, the fraudulent lease documents, the bank records showing deposits she had personally managed, the cooperation she could have offered was already in evidence. She cried during sentencing in a way that might have been genuine and might have been the final act of a woman who had been performing her entire adult life. I could not know. I chose not to speculate. What I can tell you is what I watched happen to Amma. Gerald Park stood beside her when the verdict was read. She didn't cry. She went very still, the way she had been still in my basement on the day I found her. But this was a different kind of stillness. Not the stillness of hiding. The stillness of something that has been wound so tightly for so long that it doesn't yet know how to release. Afterward, in the hallway, she let herself lean against the wall, and she laughed. A surprised, slightly chaotic sound. And Darlene put a hand on her shoulder and let her. The federal trafficking classification gave Amma immediate eligibility for a T visa, which Gerald had already prepared the application for. It was approved within 6 weeks. She had the right to remain. She had the right to work. She had the right to continue the education that had been suspended when Cheryl approached her with a laminated card and a warm smile at a church outreach meeting 2.5 years ago. She went back to school in the fall. Howard handled the civil side. The house was mine. It had always been mine, and there had never been any legitimate claim on it. But we made it formal and we made it airtight because I had learned the cost of assuming that obvious things are safe. Dennis and Cheryl's joint accounts, some of which contained housing assistance funds collected fraudulently in Amma's name, were frozen by court order and partially directed toward restitution. A portion came to Amma. It would not return what had been taken. Nothing could. But it was something solid, and solid things matter. Detective Reyes stopped by the house the week after sentencing. He sat at the kitchen table. I've stopped minding when people sit there, and drank my coffee and told me that the investigation had identified 3 additional potential victims connected to the same scheme in adjacent counties. 2 of them had come forward. The case was expanding. He was glad, he said, that I had made the call from Patricia's landline that September night. So am I said. A lot of people would have tried to handle it privately, he said. Not as a judgment, just as an observation. I know, I said. I almost did. He nodded. He finished his coffee. He left without making it more than it was, which is another thing I've learned to be grateful for. I went to the basement 2 weeks after the trial. Not immediately. I needed the interval. I went down with a box of contractor bags and Raymond's old shop light, and I cleaned. I removed what had been left there. I washed the concrete floor. I opened the window wells and let the March air come through, cold and clean and carrying the particular sharpness of a season that has decided to be new. I did not reseal it. The door is open. The stairs are solid. There is a new light fixture with a proper switch. What does victory feel like? It doesn't feel like triumph, exactly. Triumph is too bright, too uncomplicated. It feels more like winter light, pale and level and true, coming into a room that was dark for longer than it should have been. Spring came slowly that year, the way good things sometimes do. By degrees, apologetically, as if it weren't entirely sure it had permission to arrive. I planted the garden earlier than usual. The rose bushes along the south fence had needed attention for 2 years, and I gave it to them properly. That March, good compost, a careful pruning, the kind of work that asks nothing of you except patience and presence. Patricia came by on Saturdays, and we gardened in companionable parallel. By April, the first buds were showing. Amma called on a Tuesday in late spring from the campus library, where she'd re-enrolled. She was taking a full course load: environmental science, a calculus sequence, a seminar on water systems in West Africa that she described with an enthusiasm that reminded me of the way Raymond used to talk about woodworking when he'd found a new technique. She had 2 friends who were, she said, proper friends. She used the word proper with emphasis, the way someone does when they're distinguishing something from its lesser imitation. She came to the house for Thanksgiving. She brought a peanut stew her mother had taught her to make that filled the kitchen with a smell I didn't know but immediately liked. Patricia came. Darlene came. Tom Beaumont came with his wife. We sat at Raymond's table and ate until we were satisfied. Dennis served his sentence at a medium security facility 3 hours from the city. I did not visit. I did not write. I received 1 letter saying he was sorry without specifying for what. I put it in the fireproof lockbox. That decision is mine to make in my own time. Cheryl was released after 3 years with credit for good behavior. She moved to another state, her sister's house, then a rental. She lost her professional certifications. The church where she and Dennis had cultivated their standing quietly removed them from the membership rolls the week after the verdict. She was not my concern. Howard updated my will that autumn. I made Amma a beneficiary of a modest fund tied to her educational expenses. Not life-changing money, but intentional money, the kind that says, I see the direction you're going, and I want to help it. She didn't know about it. I planned to tell her when she graduated. I turned 72 in November. Patricia baked the cake. Tyler came by with a card everyone in the neighborhood had signed. I read every name. The wind chime by the kitchen window, the same one Raymond and I had hung in 1987, rang that evening in a late autumn gust. I stood in the doorway and listened. There is a kind of peace that is not the absence of difficulty, but the presence of yourself within it. Standing upright, clear-eyed, still here. Now I do. I used to think wisdom meant knowing the right answers. I've learned it means refusing to accept the wrong ones, even when they arrive in a familiar voice at your own kitchen table with flowers. Do not look away. Not from what frightens you. Not from what your love makes you want to explain away. The truth, seen clearly and acted on with courage, is the only foundation that holds. What would you have done in my place? Tell me in the comments. Share this with someone who needs to hear it. Thank you for listening.
My husband said, "You never worked a day in your life for all 75 years. I want a divorce." He had no idea that I had secretly been earning $500,000 a year my whole life. I nodded and signed everything without objection. He celebrated for a week, but a month later he... Good day, dear listeners. It's Clara again. I'm glad you're here with me. Please like this video and listen to my story till the end and let me know which city you're listening from. That way I can see how far my story has traveled. My name is Dorothy Mae Whitfield, and I was 75 years old the morning my husband of 52 years looked me in the eye across our kitchen table and told me I had never worked a day in my life. I remember the smell of the coffee. I had brewed it the same way every morning for 5 decades. 2 scoops of dark roast, a pinch of cinnamon, the way Gerald had asked me to do it back in 1971 when we were newly married and living in that little apartment in Columbus, Ohio. The morning light came through the yellow curtains I had sewn myself. The cardinal that lived in the oak tree outside was singing. Everything looked ordinary. Everything looked like home. "You never worked a day in 75 years, Gerald said, and his voice was flat, the way it gets when he has already made up his mind about something. Not a real day, not a real job. I set down my mug. I did not cry. I did not raise my voice. I simply looked at the man I had married in the summer of 1972, the man I had nursed through 2 knee surgeries and a bout of pneumonia that nearly took him in 2014, the man I had followed from Columbus to Cincinnati to Atlanta and back again as his sales career moved us across the country like furniture. And I nodded. "All right, Gerald," I said. "But let me tell you something about Dorothy Mae Whitfield. I have never been all right about anything in my life without first understanding it completely." The trouble had not started that morning. Looking back, I can trace the first thread to about 18 months earlier, when our youngest son, Craig, moved back from Phoenix after his divorce. He was 50 years old and heartbroken, and Gerald welcomed him with an open door and a sympathetic ear, which I understood. What I did not understand was why Craig began to sit in on Gerald's phone calls, why he began to accompany Gerald to the bank on Tuesday mornings, why, when I came into the living room one evening in October, both of them went quiet in the particular way that people go quiet when they have been talking about you. I noticed, but I said nothing. That is something people have always underestimated about me. I am a noticer. By spring, there were other things. Gerald had started calling me the wife in conversations with Craig, as though I were a category rather than a person. He stopped asking my opinion about decisions that had always been made together. The investment accounts, the property taxes on the lake house in Tennessee that my own mother had left to me. He stopped, just like that, as if I had already ceased to matter. And then there was Renee. Renee Calloway was 53 years old, divorced, and had been Gerald's administrative assistant at the insurance firm where he had worked before his retirement 7 years ago. She had attended our anniversary party the previous June. She had complimented my hydrangeas and eaten 2 pieces of my lemon cake and smiled at me with the particular warmth of a woman who knows something you do not. I found her name in Gerald's phone in late January, not by snooping. I want to be clear about that. His phone lit up on the kitchen counter while he was in the shower, and the name was simply there, Renee, 9:47 p.m. I did not open the message. I did not need to. The hour was enough. I am 75 years old. I have been alive long enough to know what a 9:47 p.m. text from a woman named Renee means. So when Gerald sat across from me that Tuesday morning in March and told me he wanted a divorce and told me I had never worked, never contributed, never built anything of value in my life, I understood that the speech had been prepared. I understood that Craig had probably helped him practice it. I understood that Renee was waiting somewhere, patient as a cat outside a mouse hole. I nodded. "All right, Gerald," I said again. He slid a manila folder across the table. Inside were divorce papers, already drafted. The settlement offer was modest. It assumed quite confidently that I had no assets of my own. It assumed that I was exactly what he had described. A woman who had never worked, never saved, never planned. I picked up the pen he offered me. I signed every page. He looked surprised for just a moment, surprised that I hadn't argued, hadn't wept, hadn't thrown the coffee mug. Then the surprise faded, and something that looked very much like relief spread across his face. He celebrated that evening. I heard him on the phone with Craig, laughing. I went upstairs, sat at the small writing desk in the guest room, and opened my laptop. I had some calls to make. I had some things to arrange. Gerald had made one very serious miscalculation. He had spent 52 years assuming he knew everything about me. He did not know me at all. The guest room had been mine in all but name for the last 3 years. I had moved there gradually, the way water moves, slowly, quietly, without announcing itself. A book here, a cardigan there, my reading lamp. Eventually, the small writing desk that had belonged to my mother. Gerald had never commented on the migration. I think he had been relieved. I sat at that desk the night after I signed the papers, and I made myself look at the numbers. This is something most people do not do. Most people, when they are frightened, look away from the numbers. They make tea. They call a friend. They convince themselves that things are not as bad as they seem, or that someone will come along and fix what is broken. I have never been that kind of woman. My mother taught me that fear is only dangerous when you refuse to examine it. Look at the thing directly, she used to say. It always has less teeth than you imagine. I opened my personal records, not the joint accounts. Those I already knew were titled in Gerald's name, a decision we had made in 1987 for tax purposes that I had never troubled to revisit. I was looking at my own accounts, the ones Gerald did not know about because Gerald had never asked and I had never offered. Here is something I have never told anyone, not even my daughter Patricia. I began investing in 1981. It started small. I had taken in alterations and sewing work since the late 1970s when the children were young and Gerald's salary barely covered the mortgage. It was quiet work, done at the kitchen table after the children were in bed. Neighbors brought me their wedding dresses, their christening gowns, their sons' prom suits. I charged fair prices, and I saved every dollar I earned in a separate account at a separate bank. By 1981, I had $4,000 saved. A woman at my church, Harriet Boone, an accountant, suggested I put it in a mutual fund. I did. And then I kept adding to it, year after year, as the sewing business grew into something larger. I began making custom quilts that sold through a small mail-order catalog. Then, in 1994, when the internet arrived, I opened an online shop. I had a talent for it that surprised even me. The quilts sold in New York and California and London. I hired 2 women to help with the sewing. I incorporated the business quietly in 1997 under my maiden name, Dorothy May Hargrove, LLC. And I never mentioned it to Gerald, not because I was hiding it, but because Gerald had never once asked what I did with my days. By 2010, the business was turning over $400,000 a year. By 2020, closer to $600,000. I had invested conservatively and consistently for 40 years. I owned 4 properties outright. The lake house that had come from my mother, plus 3 small rental units in Cincinnati that I had purchased with my own earnings in the late 1990s. My financial advisor, a careful woman named Susan Park at a firm in Atlanta, managed a portfolio worth approximately $2.3 million. Gerald knew none of this. I sat at my desk that night and I was honest with myself about 2 things. The first was fear, real fear, the physical kind, that settled in my chest and made my hands cold. Not fear of losing Gerald. That particular grief had already come and gone over the past 18 months as I watched him make his preparations. The fear was something older and more complicated. The fear of being seen finally after a lifetime of invisibility. the fear of what a courtroom might do with the story of a 75-year-old woman who had quietly accumulated a fortune while her husband looked through her as though she were glass. The second thing I was honest about was this. Those divorce papers I had signed were not the end. They were a first draft. Gerald's attorney had prepared them under the assumption that there were no hidden assets on my side. Under Georgia law, if that assumption held, the settlement I had signed would stand. But the settlement I had signed was the one Gerald's lawyer had prepared. It was not the one I intended to live with. I had signed those papers quickly and without argument because I needed Gerald to feel safe. I needed him to stop watching me. I needed him to celebrate with Craig and call Renee and sleep soundly, convinced that he had won before the game had properly started. Because here is what Gerald did not understand about a woman who has managed a business quietly for 40 years. She is very, very good at patience, and she is very, very good at planning. I picked up my phone and texted Susan Park. "Can we meet Thursday? I need to review everything, all accounts. I'll explain when I see you." Then I opened a second contact and typed a message to a name I had kept in my phone for 2 years, ever since Patricia had given it to me after her own divorce. A family law attorney. Sharp, Patricia had said. Expensive, worth every cent. Her name was Margaret Ossie and her office was in Buckhead. I sent the message at 11:14 p.m. She replied at 11:47. "Thursday works. 10 a.m. Bring everything." Downstairs, I could hear Gerald watching television. Some sports program, the volume too loud, the way it always was, the sound of a man completely at ease. Good, I thought. Let him be at ease. Margaret Ossie's office was on the 14th floor of a glass building off Peachtree Road, and the view from her conference room looked out over the Atlanta skyline on a clear March morning. She was in her late 40s with close-cropped natural hair and reading glasses on a chain around her neck, and she had the particular quality I most admire in a professional. She listened before she spoke. I laid everything on the table. My business incorporation documents, my personal investment records, the deeds to the 4 properties, Susan Park's most recent portfolio summary, the signed divorce papers Gerald had presented me with 6 days earlier. Margaret read without interrupting. She took notes in a small leather notebook with a green pen. When she finished, she set the papers down, removed her glasses, and looked at me directly. "Mrs. Whitfield," she said, "do you understand what you've signed?" "I signed what Gerald gave me," I said. "I signed it to make him feel certain." She was quiet for a moment. "Under Georgia law, this settlement is preliminary. It hasn't been filed with the court yet. Gerald's attorney likely submitted it last week. I can check. But there's a response window. More importantly, a significant portion of your documented assets appear to be separate property, predating the marriage or acquired independently. His attorney either didn't know about them or assumed you didn't." "He assumed I didn't," I said. She allowed herself a small, precise smile. "Then his assumption is going to be expensive." We spent 3 hours together that morning. By the time I left, Margaret had a full picture of my financial life, a retainer check, and a plan. She would file a formal response to the divorce petition, disclosing my assets appropriately and contesting the settlement terms. She would also initiate a review of the joint marital assets, specifically the investment accounts Gerald controlled, to determine whether any funds had been moved or liquidated in anticipation of the divorce. That last item had been Susan Park's suggestion when we met on Thursday afternoon. Susan was 55, methodical, and had managed my money with the loyalty of someone who understood exactly what it had cost me to earn it. "Dorothy," she said, spreading account statements across her desk. "Look at this." She pointed to a series of withdrawals from our joint brokerage account, the one I had contributed to jointly with Gerald for 30 years. Between September and February, approximately $340,000 had been moved in increments small enough to avoid automatic reporting flags. The transfers led to an account I did not recognize. "When did this start?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "September," Susan said, "right around the time Craig moved back." So it had been planned for at least 6 months. Gerald had not simply woken up one morning and decided he wanted a new life. He and Craig had constructed this. The asset transfers, the drafted settlement papers, the calculated insult across the breakfast table, as a coordinated effort to leave me with as little as possible. I sat with that knowledge for a moment. I let it be what it was. Then I took out a notepad and asked Susan to walk me through every transaction. The following week, I did something I had been putting off out of old habit. I hired a private investigator. His name was Carl Briggs, retired Atlanta PD, recommended by Margaret. I gave him Renee Calloway's name and address and asked him to document what he could. Under Georgia law, adultery is relevant to divorce proceedings in certain circumstances. I was not interested in revenge. I was interested in the complete picture. Carl called me 12 days later. "Mrs. Whitfield," he said, "I've got photographs. I've got hotel receipts from the last 14 months. I've got documentation of a joint checking account opened between Gerald Whitfield and Renee Calloway in November of last year." November, 2 months after the asset transfers began. I thanked Carl, asked him to compile everything into a formal report, and sat quietly for a minute in my car in the parking lot of the Publix on Roswell Road. A woman was loading groceries into a minivan. A child was waving at a dog. The sky was very blue and very ordinary. 14 months. Gerald had been planning this for at least 14 months. I thought about the anniversary party last June. Renee complimenting my hydrangeas, eating my lemon cake, sitting in my garden. 14 months. There was a weight to the knowing that I had expected to be heavier. Instead, what I felt was something close to clarity. Not peace, not yet, but the specific, useful feeling of a woman who finally understands the exact size and shape of the problem in front of her. I drove home. Gerald was in the garage, washing his car, the way he did every Saturday. He waved at me as I pulled in. I waved back. "Good morning, Gerald," I said. "Morning," he said. He did not ask where I had been. Margaret filed our formal response on the first Tuesday of April, and the effect was immediate. Gerald's attorney was a man named Philip Dorn, and according to Margaret, he called her office within 2 hours of receiving the filing. She described the call to me that evening, her voice carrying the careful neutrality of someone relaying information without editorializing, though I could hear the satisfaction underneath. He was not expecting it, she said. Specifically, he was not expecting the asset disclosure. He said, and I'm quoting, "This is a surprise." I told him it shouldn't be. The disclosure detailed everything: the business, the investment portfolio, the 4 properties. It also included a formal request for a full accounting of the joint marital assets, specifically the $340,000 in transfers that Susan Park had documented. Margaret had attached Susan's analysis as an exhibit. Gerald came home that evening and did not speak to me at dinner. He sat at the opposite end of the table. We were still living in the house, which was procedurally normal during proceedings, and ate his pot roast with the rigid silence of a man rearranging his understanding of his situation. I ate my dinner and read the newspaper. The following Saturday morning, Craig arrived at 9 o'clock. He did not knock. He had a key he had been given when he moved back from Phoenix, and he used it now with the confidence of a man who believes the house belongs to him by extension. I was in the sunroom with my coffee when I heard the front door. They both came to find me. Craig was 50 years old and had his father's build, broad-shouldered, a little soft now around the middle. And he stood in the doorway of the sunroom with his arms crossed and his jaw set in the expression I had watched him practice since he was 14. Gerald stood slightly behind him, which told me everything about who was driving this visit. "Mom," Craig said, "we need to talk about what you're doing." "I'm having my coffee," I said. "Would you like some?" "This isn't funny." His voice was tight. "Dad showed me the filing. You've been hiding money. You've been running a business without telling anyone. Do you understand what that looks like?" "I understand exactly what it looks like," I said. "It looks like a woman who worked hard and managed her finances carefully." "You made us look like fools," Gerald said from the doorway. I turned to look at him. He was wearing his old blue cardigan, the one I had bought him for Christmas in 2009. I noticed that detail, and then I let it go. "You filed divorce papers, Gerald," I said. "You filed them after moving $340,000 out of our joint accounts. You opened a bank account with Renee Calloway in November. I have the documentation on all 3 of those things. I didn't make you look like a fool. You made your own decisions." The silence that followed had a quality I recognized. It was the silence of 2 people recalculating. Craig moved first. He stepped fully into the sunroom and lowered his voice to something that was meant to sound reasonable. "Mom, listen. Dad is willing to be generous. He said he'd increase the settlement offer. You'd have the house, the car, a monthly payment. You'd be comfortable. But if you keep going with this lawyer, these filings, these accusations, it's going to get ugly. It's going to be in the courts for a year or more. Is that what you want at your age? The stress? The exposure?" The exposure. There it was. He meant the business. He meant the accounts. He meant the possibility that a courtroom would ask why I had kept my finances separate for 4 decades, and whether that could be characterized as deceptive. I set down my coffee cup. "Craig," I said, "I have a very good attorney who has advised me on exactly what I am entitled to and exactly how to proceed. I'd encourage you and your father to speak with Mr. Dorn before this conversation goes any further." "We're not leaving until we reach an understanding," Craig said. "Then I'll ask you to leave," I said, "because this is still my home, and you don't have the right to use your key to enter it for the purpose of pressuring me." Something shifted in Craig's face. The reasonable mask slipped, just briefly, and I saw the anger underneath. He looked at his father. Gerald looked at his shoes. "You'll regret this," Craig said. "I doubt it," I said. They left. I sat in the sunroom for a long time after the front door closed. The cardinal was in the oak tree again. My coffee had gone cold. I will be honest. My hands were shaking. Not from fear exactly, or not only from fear, but from the expenditure of something. The effort of holding absolutely still while 2 men tried to push me. I was 75 years old, and I had just stood my ground in my own sunroom, and it had cost me something physical. I called Patricia that afternoon. "Come for the weekend," I said. "I'll tell you everything." She drove up from Savannah on Friday evening, and I spent those 4 days doing very little. I walked in the garden. I slept. I let my daughter bring me tea and sit beside me while I told her the whole story from the beginning. She cried. I did not. I was past that particular shore. On Monday morning, I called Margaret Osei and told her to proceed. Gerald's next move came not from Gerald himself, but through a mutual friend, a woman named Barbara Hutchins, who had been part of our social circle since the early 1990s. Barbara was well-meaning in the way that certain people are well-meaning, energetically, and with great confidence that they know what is best. She called me on a Wednesday morning in late April and asked if she could come for lunch. I said yes, because I had nothing to hide and because I was curious. We sat on the back porch with chicken salad sandwiches and iced tea, and Barbara looked at me with the expression of someone who has prepared a speech. "Dorothy," she said, "I've been talking to Gerald." "I assumed as much," I said. She leaned forward. "He's really struggling. He looks terrible, Dorothy. He's not sleeping. Craig says he barely eats." She paused. "He made a mistake. He knows that. But he told me to tell you. He's willing to drop all of it. Call the whole thing off, go to counseling, start fresh." I looked at the garden. The peonies were just coming in, pale pink against the brick wall my father had helped us build in 1984. "Barbara," I said, "I appreciate you coming. I know Gerald asked you to, and I know you're trying to help. But I need you to understand something. A man who spent at least 14 months planning to leave me, who moved money out of our joint accounts in anticipation, who opened a bank account with another woman, that man is not struggling because he misses me. He's struggling because the plan didn't work the way he expected." Barbara's expression flickered. "I'm not angry," I continued. "I want you to hear that clearly. I'm not a bitter woman looking for revenge. I'm a 75-year-old woman who built something quietly over 50 years and is now making sure she keeps what she earned." I picked up my iced tea. "That's all this is." Barbara drove away an hour later without having accomplished whatever she had come to accomplish. I watched her car from the front window and felt something I can only describe as settled. Like a house after a storm, when everything is still and you realize the structure held. The calls from Gerald's side went quiet after that. Margaret told me that Philip Dorn had requested a 6-week delay in proceedings, citing ongoing settlement discussions. Margaret granted 2 weeks and not a day more. In the meantime, I made 2 calls that mattered. The first was to my pastor, Reverend Gloria Simmons, at the Northside congregation I had attended for 30 years. I had been avoiding church since the separation, out of a combination of exhaustion and the particular discomfort of being the subject of other people's concern. But Gloria had known me since 1995, and when I finally called, she did not offer pity or opinions. She said, "Come Sunday, just come." I did. Afterward, she took me to lunch and sat across from me for 2 hours and simply bore witness to what I had been carrying. That is a gift that cannot be overstated. The second call was to a woman named Louise Chen, who ran a small women's financial literacy organization in Midtown Atlanta. I had donated to the organization for years, but never involved myself directly. Now I called Louise and told her I wanted to become more active. We had coffee the following Tuesday, and she introduced me to several women in their 40s, 50s, 60s, who had navigated similar situations in various forms. No 2 stories were identical, but there was a common thread: women who had contributed quietly, invisibly, for decades, and then found themselves at the table without credit. I began attending Louise's monthly meetings. I don't want to overstate the importance of this. I was not healed by community, and the legal process was not simplified by friendship. But there is something that changes in you when you sit in a room full of people who already understand the particular shape of your experience without you having to explain it. You stop using so much energy on the explanation. You have more left for the work, and there was still work to do. Margaret called me in the second week of May with an update on the asset tracing. Gerald's attorney had responded to our accounting request, and the response had been, in Margaret's word, incomplete. They've accounted for $210,000 of the $340,000, she said. The remaining $130,000 has been characterized as personal expenditures. They haven't provided documentation. That's not going to satisfy a judge, I said. No, Margaret said, it is not. They came on a Sunday. I know they chose Sunday deliberately. There is a softness to Sundays that people try to exploit. The cooking smells, the slower pace, the memory of how things used to be. I had a pot of vegetable soup on the stove, and the windows open to the warm May air, and when the doorbell rang, I looked out the front window and saw Gerald's car in the driveway with Craig's truck behind it. I let them in. I had decided beforehand that I would let them in because refusing entry would have felt like fear, and I was not afraid. I was clear. Gerald looked as Barbara had described, thinner, slower, with the slightly gray quality of a man who has not been sleeping. He was wearing a button-down shirt, pressed, which told me someone had prepared him for this visit. Craig was in his weekend clothes, more relaxed, which told me Craig was the one who felt confident. They sat in the living room. I brought coffee without being asked, because offering hospitality in my own home was not concession. It was simply who I was. Dorothy, Gerald began. I've been doing a lot of thinking. He spoke for about 10 minutes. It was a prepared speech, smooth in the places where he had rehearsed it, and rough in the places where the rehearsal had missed something. He talked about our history, our children, the years we had built together. He said he had made serious mistakes. He said Renee meant nothing, a phrase I found almost mathematically interesting in its inaccuracy, given the 14 months of documentation Carl Briggs had assembled. He said he wanted to find a solution that was fair to both of us. I listened without interrupting. I am a good listener. When he finished, Craig leaned forward. Mom, here's the reality. The legal process is going to drag this out for a year, maybe 2. You're 75. The stress alone. He let the sentence sit there, unfinished, which was a technique I recognized. The stress alone was meant to imply that I might not survive the proceeding, that my age made me fragile. The reality, Craig continued, is that Dad's team has found some questions about your business filings from the late 90s, some years where the income wasn't reported jointly. A tax attorney they've consulted thinks there could be liability. There it was. I looked at Craig. I looked at Gerald, who was studying the carpet. Craig, I said, I have had a CPA and a tax attorney review every filing associated with my business going back to 1981. Everything was filed correctly under my separate business entity. There is no liability. I paused. But I think you know that already. I think Mr. Dorn told you that the tax angle wasn't viable, and this is what you came up with instead. Craig's jaw tightened. You're being paranoid. I'm being accurate, I said. There's a difference. Gerald looked up from the carpet. There was something in his face that I had not expected. Not anger, exactly, but a kind of helpless frustration. The expression of a man who has discovered that the story he told himself about his wife was not the true story. For just a moment, I felt something that was almost sympathy. Then I thought about September, about the first transfer, about the careful, patient, deliberate dismantling of our shared life while I was making his coffee and sewing his grandchildren's Christmas stockings. The sympathy passed. I think this conversation is finished, I said. Craig stood up. His voice, when it came, had dropped into something cold and controlled that was, in its own way, more alarming than shouting. You are going to be very alone when this is done. Your children, your grandchildren, they're going to have to choose, and you might not like what they choose. I stood as well. I am 5'4" and 75 years old, and I looked my son in the face. My children are not a bargaining chip, I said, and if you use them as one, that will be something you have to live with, not me. They left. I sat back down in the living room after the door closed, and I will be honest with you, I was frightened. Not of the lawsuit, not of Gerald. Frightened of that last thing Craig had said, the specific vulnerability of a grandmother who would rather lose everything else than lose her grandchildren. He had found the real edge of me and pressed against it deliberately. But here is what fear did that evening. It clarified. I went upstairs and I wrote down every commitment Gerald and Craig had made to me over the years, every birthday dinner, every holiday I had organized, every crisis I had managed quietly so that no one else had to carry it. I wrote it all down, not out of bitterness, but because I needed to remind myself of what was real and what was theater. Then I called Patricia. They threatened the grandchildren, I said. Her answer was immediate and unambiguous. Let me call Thomas, she said. Thomas was our eldest. We'll handle this. The mediation was scheduled for the second Tuesday of June in a neutral conference room at a law firm on Peachtree Street that neither Margaret nor Dorn used professionally. These things are chosen carefully. The table was long, pale wood, the kind of table that is meant to feel serious without being intimidating. There was water in glass pitchers. There were yellow legal pads at each seat. There was morning light coming in from the east, clean and unhurried. I had arrived 15 minutes early, which was deliberate. I wanted to be seated when they walked in. I wanted the room to already be mine when they entered it. Gerald arrived with Philip Dorn and Craig. I had not expected Craig. Mediation is typically for the parties and their legal representatives, but Dorn had apparently requested his presence as family support, and Margaret had agreed with the small, precise smile that meant she had a reason for agreeing that she had not yet disclosed. I arrived with Margaret and, to Gerald's visible surprise, 2 additional people, Susan Park, my financial advisor, composed and authoritative in a navy blazer, and a man named David Whitmore, who was a forensic accountant Margaret had retained 4 weeks earlier to trace the $130,000 in personal expenditures that Gerald's team had failed to document. David Whitmore was in his late 40s, unremarkable in appearance, the kind of man you would not notice at a party. He had a leather folder and a pleasant expression, and he had spent 4 weeks following a paper trail that Gerald had assumed was invisible. Gerald looked at David Whitmore the way a man looks at something he was not prepared for. Not panic, not yet, but the particular alertness of someone recalculating. Good. The mediator was a retired judge named Honorable Patricia Okafor. Small, precise, with the patient attention of someone who has sat through thousands of human catastrophes and found in each of them a legible logic. She opened with the standard language about good faith and mutual interest and the preferability of resolution without judicial intervention. She looked at both sides of the table with the equality of someone who had long ago stopped being impressed by either money or indignation. Philip Dorn presented Gerald's revised offer first. It was meaningfully better than the original. The house in full, a larger monthly payment, a portion of the joint investment accounts. He presented it with the confidence of a man who believes he has brought a generous gift to a difficult negotiation. Under other circumstances, for a woman who truly had no independent assets, it might have seemed generous. It was the kind of offer designed to look reasonable in a courtroom if things proceeded that far. Margaret let him finish completely. She did not interrupt, did not annotate, did not signal anything. She simply listened with her hands flat on the table. Then she placed 3 documents on the table. Precisely, one at a time, the way you place cards when you already know you've won. The first was David Whitmore's forensic accounting report. The $130,000 had not been spent on personal expenditures. It had been transferred in installments, careful, measured installments, never large enough to trigger automatic scrutiny, to a personal account Gerald had opened in his name only at a credit union in Marietta, an account that had subsequently been used to make a down payment on a condominium in Renee Calloway's building. Purchased 3 months before Gerald had told me across the breakfast table that I had never worked a day in my life. Gerald's neck went red. The color started at his collar and moved upward. "That's not," he started. "The deed is in your name," David Whitmore said pleasantly. "Filed November 14th. I have the county records here if you'd like to review them." Philip Dorn wrote something on his legal pad with great concentration. He did not look up. The second document was Carl Briggs's investigative report, 14 months of documentation, hotel receipts from a Marriott in Buckhead, a Renaissance in Charleston. 3 nights at a property in Highlands, North Carolina, the previous August, which was, I noted internally, the same weekend Gerald had told me he was fishing with friends in Chattanooga. I had packed him a cooler. I had made sandwiches and wrapped them in wax paper and handed them to him at the door. He had kissed my cheek. I watched Craig read the Charleston receipt. I watched the calculation happening behind his eyes, the rapid reassessment of how much his father had told him and how much Gerald had quietly omitted from the version Craig had been given to work with. There is a particular expression that crosses a person's face when they realize they have been used as a tool without being given the full blueprint. I recognized it because I had worn it myself once, years ago, in a different context. Philip Dorn was now studying the far wall. The third document was the one Margaret had prepared last, and it was the most precise. It was a cross-reference summary of every asset I held independently, the business, the properties, the portfolio, alongside the business and tax filings, and a letter from my CPA and tax attorney confirming that every element had been reported correctly and that there was no outstanding liability of any kind. This document addressed the threat Craig and Gerald had made in my living room 3 weeks earlier. It named that threat specifically, by date and by the language used. It documented Craig's statement about my children and grandchildren being asked to choose. It documented Gerald's presence during that statement and his silence in response to it. The room was very quiet. Judge Okafor looked up from the third document. She removed her reading glasses. She looked at Dorn with the even, measured expression of a woman who has seen this particular configuration of facts before and knows exactly where it leads. "Mr. Whitfield," she said, "I'd like to give you a moment to speak with your counsel privately." They took 20 minutes. Through the conference room wall, I could hear the rise and fall of voices. Mostly Craig's, I thought, pitched too high and too fast, the voice of a person arguing with a reality that has already occurred and cannot be revised by argument. Then Gerald's voice, lower, slower, with long silences between his sentences. Then Craig again, sharper. Then silence. Margaret poured herself a glass of water and made a note in her green pen. Susan Park looked out at the Atlanta skyline. I looked at my hands on the pale table and thought about nothing in particular, which is a skill I had been practicing. When they came back, Philip Dorn looked like a man who had aged perceptibly in 20 minutes. He had the specific expression of an attorney who has discovered that his client withheld material information and who is now obligated to represent that client anyway, and who is finding this obligation professionally uncomfortable. Craig sat down without speaking. He would not look at me. "My client," Dorn said, "is prepared to discuss a revised framework." Margaret placed her hand flat on the table. "Mr. Dorn, my client isn't here to revise a framework. She's here to settle, and I have her terms in writing." She slid a document across the table with the unhurried motion of someone who has been patient long enough. "These are not opening positions. These are terms." I watched Gerald read the document. I watched his eyes move down the page, careful, slow, the way he read anything he was trying to find an argument against. I watched him reach the section on the condominium. I watched him reach the section on the joint account transfers and their complete documentation. I watched him reach the section on the independent business valuation and the proposed division of marital assets under Georgia Equitable Distribution Law, which accounted for 52 years of contribution in every form that contribution can take. He looked up at me across the long, pale table. For the first time in months, perhaps the first time in years, he looked at me with his full attention. Not through me, not past me. He looked at me the way you look at someone when you finally understand that you did not know them, and the understanding arrives too late to be useful. "Dorothy," he said. His voice had something in it that might have been, under different circumstances, the beginning of an apology. I did not close the door on it, but I did not walk through it either. "Gerald," I said quietly, "I don't need anything from you right now. I just need your signature." Craig leaned forward with one last effort. "This is extortion. You've been hiding assets. You've been building a case for years." "Craig." Judge Okafor's voice was entirely calm, the way that a very large, very certain thing is calm. "You are here in a supporting capacity. Please allow your father and his counsel to proceed." Craig sat back. His hands, on the table, were trembling slightly. I noticed that and did not comment on it. The silence that followed was the longest of the morning. Gerald looked at the document. He looked at Dorn. Dorn gave him the small nod of a man advising his client to accept the reality in front of him. Gerald picked up the pen. He signed. I watched his hand move across each page. He did not rush. He did not hesitate dramatically the way people do in films. He signed with the careful, deliberate motion of a man who has decided to accept what cannot be changed, and who is trying to preserve what remains of his dignity in the act of acceptance. I will give him that. It took another 6 weeks to finalize everything through the court. Petitions, a judge's review, the formal dissolution hearing, but in practical terms, everything was decided in that conference room on a Tuesday morning in June when Gerald Whitfield picked up Philip Dorn's pen and signed his name to Margaret Osei's terms. I will tell you what those terms were, because specificity is how you keep the story your own. I retained full ownership of my business, Dorothy May Hargrove, LLC, and all its associated assets and future earnings, which I had always owned independently. I retained the lake house in Tennessee, which had come from my mother's estate. I retained the 3 rental properties in Cincinnati, clear of any marital claim, along with their income streams. I retained my investment portfolio in full, the product of 40 years of quiet, consistent, unglamorous work. With respect to the marital assets, the joint investment accounts, the equity in the Atlanta house, the retirement funds Gerald and I had contributed to together, we divided them according to Georgia's equitable distribution principles, which account for the contributions of both spouses in every form those contributions take. Margaret had documented my contributions carefully. 30 years of joint account deposits from my business income, 30 years of household and child care management that had freed Gerald to travel, build his career, and be available for work dinners and fishing trips, because someone else was reliably managing everything else. The division was not equal in the strict arithmetic sense. It was equitable. There is an important difference between those two words. I also received the Atlanta house outright, in lieu of my share of the joint investment accounts. The house I had lived in for 23 years, where I had grown the hydrangeas and sewn the curtains and raised the children. That house was mine. The condominium in Renee's building, purchased with $130,000 in marital funds, documented to the last decimal point by David Whitmore, was classified as a marital asset and factored into the division accordingly. Gerald's attorney filed 2 motions to reclassify it as a personal acquisition. Judge Okafor denied both with the brevity of someone who has already explained a thing once and does not intend to explain it again. The tax liability threat was never raised again in any professional context. My CPA's letter was part of the permanent record. The matter was closed. In the weeks following the mediation, Margaret sent a formal letter documenting the verbal exchange in my living room on the Sunday in May. Specifically, Craig's statement about my children and grandchildren being made to choose, delivered in my own home, over coffee I had made for him. The letter noted that any further contact of that nature from Craig would be treated as a matter for the court. Craig did not respond. The formal dissolution hearing lasted 45 minutes in a small carpeted room on the 4th floor of the Fulton County Courthouse. Gerald looked at the judge. I looked at the judge. Our attorneys spoke the necessary language. The judge reviewed the settlement, confirmed that both parties had signed voluntarily and with legal counsel, and approved the dissolution. She stamped the paperwork at 2:47 in the afternoon. I walked out into the July heat and stood on the courthouse steps for a moment, the way you stand when you have set down something you have been carrying for a long time and your body needs a moment to understand the new weight of itself. Margaret stood beside me. She did not say anything immediately, which I appreciated. Then she said, "You did well, Dorothy." I thought about Gerald at the breakfast table with his manila folder. I thought about Craig in the sunroom with his arms crossed. I thought about Renee's name on a phone screen at 9:47 on a cold January night. I thought about every hour at the writing desk in the guest room, building the case document by document, with the patience of a woman who had learned that the work that lasts is always done quietly. I did what needed doing, I said. We walked to the parking garage in the July afternoon, and the city went on around us, indifferent and enormous. I felt, not triumphant, not vindicated, though I was both. I felt free, entirely and completely free, the kind that doesn't announce itself. That just settles into your bones like good weather and stays. I turned 76 in October, and Patricia threw me a party in the garden. She strung lights in the oak tree and the hydrangea bushes, and my grandchildren ran through the yard in the warm fall evening, while Reverend Gloria Simmons laughed at something Louise Chen said about Atlanta traffic. Thomas was there with his family, and my oldest granddaughter Emma sat beside me and said, "Grandma, you're kind of a legend." I told Emma that I preferred the word practical. The months after the divorce had a quality of expansion, the way a room feels larger when the furniture is rearranged. I redecorated the house, not dramatically, but because it was mine now in a way it hadn't been before. I kept the yellow curtains. I changed almost everything else. I became more involved with Louise's organization. In January, I gave a practical talk on business registration and financial separation to a room of 40 women. 6 of them came to speak to me afterward. I ended up speaking at 4 more events that year. The Cincinnati rental properties I handed to a management firm, freeing up time and attention. My quilt business continued strong. A new spring line sold better than anything in years. Susan and I built a solid 5-year financial plan, and I felt genuinely in control of my future for the first time in a long time. I was not lonely. The loneliness I had feared never arrived. What came instead was peace in my own company, something 52 years of marriage had left no room for. I drove alone to Tennessee in April, opened the lake house, and sat on the dock all morning watching the water without speaking to anyone. It was one of the finest mornings of my life. As for Gerald and Craig, I heard things, as one does. Gerald and Renee moved in together by August. By November, mutual friends called the relationship complicated. She was 53 with her own retirement expectations. He was 77, humbled, living on less than anticipated. These things rarely combine smoothly. Craig was 50, working a sales job that wasn't going well. His relationship with Thomas had cooled after the mediation, once Thomas understood the full picture. Craig had expected family solidarity. He received quiet judgment instead. I did not gloat. When I thought of them, I felt something closer to sorrow, not for myself, but for the waste of it all. I didn't carry their story. I had my own, and it was a good one. They are wrong. Here's what I learned. Invisibility is not weakness. Patience is not surrender. And the woman who keeps her records always outlasts the man who keeps his assumptions. So tell me, if someone looked at your life and said it counted for nothing, what would you do? Think carefully. Thank you for listening from the bottom of my heart. Dorothy.